Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for tuning in this evening for our online Bible study. Let's get into it. I welcome you. If you are new to this study, I'm Pastor Dave St. Aubin. It's a joy to be with you here this evening. Tonight, we will be looking at the book of Ezekiel, chapter 16. So I invite you to grab your Bibles, open them up to Ezekiel 16, grab something to take some good notes with, grab a beverage, grab a snack. Let's get into it. Well, again, good evening and welcome, and thanks for tuning in. I do pray that you're having a wonderful day. Pray that you had a blessed weekend and appreciate you being here this evening as we continue our journey through the Bible, one chapter at a time. We've made it now into the book of Ezekiel, chapter 16, and so we are about a third of the way through this book. And chapter 16 is by far the longest prophetic message within the book of Ezekiel. It's the longest single oracle within the Old Testament, and it's the longest single allegory within the entire Bible. What we're going to look at tonight is this, in its form, it's a lawsuit oracle. This is Jerusalem's history as being a prostitute. And the theme of what we're going to look at tonight carries forward the theme of the guilt of Jerusalem that was described, what we saw on Friday, in chapter 15. God's chosen people were not only a vine that was good for nothing, which is what we saw in chapter 15 last time we were together, but they had produced disgusting fruit. And that's what we're going to see tonight. It's in part, a very explicit oracle, in some parts pretty graphic. And what God is comparing Jerusalem to here, and Jerusalem in the context encompasses all of Israel, that Israel is a despised orphan who had become the beautiful wife of a king, but then had abandoned the privileges that came with that relationship, to then becoming a insatiable prostitute. And so we have a lot to look at here tonight. Again, chapter 16, the longest within the book of Ezekiel, over 60 verses. So we have a lot to talk about tonight. So let's get right into it here. Open up your Bibles to Ezekiel chapter 16. If you don't have a Bible with you, not a problem. As always, all the verses are up here on the screen, so you can follow along, take some good notes tonight. And we'll start with verse 1, Ezekiel 16, of this comparison of Israel going through this phase from orphan to bride of a king to prostitute. Verse 1, the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, confront Jerusalem with her detestable practices. And remember, Jerusalem here contextually encompasses all of the Israelites, not just those living in Jerusalem. So God is instructing Ezekiel to make these detestable practices of the people known to them. Verse 3, say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says to Jerusalem. Your ancestry and your birth were in the land of the Canaanites. Your father was an Amorite. Your mother was a Hittite. So Ezekiel here, he's prophesying in Babylon to the exiles. But again, this message is presented to the people as a whole, and he's writing to convict them and to display this humiliation they had brought on themselves. God is personifying Jerusalem as a woman. And he's relating the history here as allegory. And in this story, again, Jerusalem represents the people of Israel throughout their history. That is who is in view here. Verse 4, on the day that you were born, your cord was not cut, nor were you washed with water to make you clean. So when Jerusalem came into existence, they received no special treatment. They didn't even receive normal care. Jerusalem was not an outstanding city from its inception. Many other cities in Canaan were better. They were better situated geographically. They had better physical resources. They were more easily defensible militarily. So God is saying, when you came into existence, you were nothing special, nor were you rubbed with salt or wrapped in cloths. Now, in this time period, it was custom in this time to wash a newborn child, to rub salt on the body for antiseptic reasons, wrap it in cloths, and change these cloths twice by the 40th day after the umbilical cord was cut. That was normal. Jerusalem, when you came into existence, your cord was not cut. You were not washed with water to make you clean. You were not rubbed with salt. You were not wrapped in cloths. Verse 5, no one looked on you with pity. No one had compassion enough to do any of these things for you. Instead, you were thrown out into the open field, for on the day that you were born, you were despised. So rather than receiving this normal treatment, so to speak, with the people of Israel in their history, nobody had compassion on them. Nobody had compassion on Jerusalem. In fact, they had all been abandoned because they were like an unwanted child. They were like an orphan. Now, a common method of disposing of unwanted children in this time period, especially the girls, was to just abandon them to the elements. And so God is saying this is how you were perceived. You were abandoned as orphans to the elements. When the Israelites entered into the land of promise in the day of Joshua, this goes back to Joshua 15, verse 63, they did not take possession of Jerusalem, at least not yet. And so God is laying the groundwork here. At your beginning, when you entered into the land of promise, you were not welcomed. You were not treated as a newborn. In fact, you were cast out as an orphan. You were despised by the people. That's in their infancy. Verses 6 through 14 describe Jerusalem in their youth. So verse 6, and then I passed by, and I saw you kicking about in your blood. So God had compassion on the people in their helpless, undesirable condition, and took care of this orphaned woman so that she would survive, so that the Israelites would survive. Now the city, Jerusalem, remained as a unwanted child until, at the direction of the Lord, David captured it from the Jebusites, 2 Samuel 5, and made Jerusalem the capital of his kingdom. Next verse, and as you lay there in your blood, I said to you, live. And I made you grow like a plant in the field, and you grew and you developed. You entered puberty, and your breasts had formed and your hair had grown, and yet you were still stark naked. So God enabled Jerusalem to not just live but thrive. The inhabitants became numerous. They prospered. They grew. Eventually, they developed like a youth going through puberty into a very fine city, even though their start in life was a horrible start in life. And during the reigns of David and Solomon, Jerusalem was one of the most highly respected cities in this part of the world. Verse 8, and later I passed by, and when I looked at you and saw that you were old enough for love, I spread the corner of my garment over you. I covered your naked body. And we'll talk about that here in a second. I gave you my solemn oath. I entered into covenant with you, declares the sovereign Lord, and you became mine. So now we see the growth here from this unwanted orphan child, infant, growing and developing into this position of being loved by the Lord. Now, when they were mature enough, when the city, was mature enough, God made a covenant to take care of the people forever. Now, this spreading of the garment over somebody, it was a customary way of committing to marry that person and to provide for that person. That goes back to the book of Ruth. If you look at Ruth chapter 3, we see this. So when I looked at you, I saw that you were old enough for love, for this commitment. I proposed. I made you my wife. This is what God is saying. I took you in, verse 9, and I bathed you with water, and I washed you the blood from you. I put ointments on you. I clothed you with an embroidered dress. I put sandals of fine leather on you. I dressed you in fine linen. I covered you with costly garments. I adorned you with jewelry. I put bracelets on your arms. I put a necklace around your neck. I put a ring on your nose, earrings on your ears. I put a beautiful crown on your head. God entered into this covenant with the people and prepared this place, Jerusalem, for a very special relationship with him. And he cleaned her, he anointed her, he clothed her with beautiful, fine, expensive clothing, including fine shoes. He gave her jewelry to make her more beautiful, bracelets and a necklace and rings and earrings and nose rings and a crown. These were the glory days of Jerusalem under the rule of Solomon. This goes back to 1 Kings chapter 10. So again, God takes this unwanted orphan, watches it grow into maturity, and makes it his own. It makes it his bride. Verse 13. And so you were adorned with gold and silver. Your clothes were of fine linen. They were of costly fabric. They were of embroidered cloth. Your food was honey and olive oil, the finest flour. You became very beautiful, and you rose from this unwanted, disposed, unclean orphan into a queen. So Jerusalem had the best of the best. They ate the best food. They wore the finest clothes. In other words, the love of her husband knew no bounds. She, Jerusalem, became very beautiful, became royalty, a royal city that was the home to this dynasty of kings out of the line of David. Verse 14, and your fame spread among the nations, right? Went from this despised, rejected orphan to being famous among the nations because of your beauty, because of what the Lord had done, because of the splendor I had given you, declares the sovereign Lord. So now all the other nations are commenting on Jerusalem's beauty because it was so extraordinary, because of the grace that God had bestowed on her. However, and here's the turning point, right? Jerusalem became self-centered and unfaithful to the Lord. Verse 15, but you trusted in your beauty and you used your fame to become a prostitute, and you lavished your favors on anyone who passed by, and your beauty became his. Jerusalem, the people, had forgotten God. She had become preoccupied with other things. She went after every other passerby rather than remaining faithful to the Lord. Under King Solomon, Jerusalem became the greatest city of their day. But Solomon, in all his wisdom, led the people of Jerusalem into a spiritual adultery by making these covenants, these alliances with other nations, and by establishing idolatry in the land. And that goes back to 1 Kings chapter 11. So from despised, unclean, unwanted orphan that God was watching her grow and develop and mature. And at the right time, God made covenant, claimed her as his own, made her his bride, gave her all the best blessings. And she took all that and threw it back in the face of the Lord and prostituted herself instead, and got into this adultery, this spiritual adultery with other nations, with other idols, with all passerbys. Verse 16, you took some of your garments to make gaudy high places where you carried on your prostitution. You went to him, and he possessed your beauty. You took the fine jewelry that I gave you, the jewelry made of my gold and silver, and you made for yourself male idols, and you engaged in prostitution with them. And you took your embroidered clothes, and you put it on these idols, and you offered all this fine oil and incense, and you gave it to these idols. And the food that I provided for you, the flour, the honey, the olive oil, you offered that as a fragrant offering before these idols. That is what happened, declares Sovereign Lord. Jerusalem had used all of her gifts that God had given her to make idols, to worship these idols, to sacrifice to these idols, rather than worshiping God. And they made these phallic images out of these gifts that God had given them, in which they had engaged in sex with. That is what is being declared here by God. Verse 20. And then you took your sons and your daughters that you bore to me, and you sacrificed them as food to the idols. Was your prostitution not enough? You slaughtered my children, and you sacrificed them to the idol. So Jerusalem, as this woman, went so far as to sacrificing her own children and then offering them to these idols, disregarding the fact that they were God's children. Now, the way that this is presented here is that first the children were killed and burned, and then their bodies were offered as sacrifices. But this goes back into, we saw this in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, we saw it in Jeremiah 32. This is the practice that the Israelites were partaking in at this time. Verse 22, and in all your detestable practices, and in all your prostitution, you did not remember the days of your youth, going back to where you were naked and bare, kicking about in your blood, which is what we just saw in these first few verses. So they had forgot. They had forgot about their humble origins, and that they owed their very existence and their blessings to God. And on top of all this wickedness, Jerusalem multiplied these shrines to idols everywhere. And for that, God is about to pronounce a lament of horror upon the people. Verse 23, woe, woe to you, declares Sovereign Lord. In addition to all your other wickedness, you built a mound for yourself. You made a lofty shrine in every public square. At every street corner, you built your lofty shrines. You degraded your beauty, spreading your legs with increasing promiscuity to anyone who passed by. She had become an advocate of idolatry, not just a practicer of idolatry, but an advocate of it, building these shrines and these temples for idol worship everywhere. And she made her beauty an abomination by prostituting herself to everyone who walked by. She pursued these alliances with these idols and with these foreign nations. Verse 26, and you engaged in prostitution with the Egyptians, your neighbors with large genitals, and you aroused my anger with your increasing promiscuity. And so I stretched out my hand against you, I reduced your territory, I gave you over to the greed of your enemies, the daughters of the Philistines, who were shocked by your lewd conduct. So Jerusalem, the people, the Israelites, had committed this adultery with their lustful neighbor, the Egyptians. And they multiplied these instances of prostitution with the Egyptians, which angered God even further. And so, as punishment, God diminished her support and gave her into the hands of the Philistines, these pagan people who were repulsed by their lustful behavior. Verse 28. And you engaged in prostitution with not just the Egyptians, but with the Assyrians as well, because you were insatiable. And even after that, you were still not satisfied. And then you increased your promiscuity to include Babylon, a land of merchants. But even with that, you were not satisfied. So Jerusalem committed adultery first with the Egyptians and then with the distant Assyrians. None of that satisfied their lust. And so they engaged in this adultery, this prostitution with the Babylonians to try to quench their passion. But even that didn't work. They had become a spiritual nymphomaniac. Verse 30. And I am filled with fury against you, declares sovereign Lord, when you do all these things, acting like a brazen prostitute, when you build your mounds. And building mounds are these idol-worshiping shrines. When you build them at every street corner and you made these lofty shrines in every public square, you were unlike a prostitute because you scorned payment. You adulterous wife, you prefer strangers to your own husband. And that is the convicting verse in this chapter. All prostitutes receive gifts, but you gave gifts to your lovers. You bribed them to come to you from everywhere for your illicit favors. And so in your prostitution, you are the opposite of others. No one runs after you for favors. You are the opposite. You give payment. None is given back. And all her brazen adulteries, it had left Jerusalem, the people, with a very sick heart. She could no longer feel true love. And God is saying, you are worse than a common prostitute because you are practicing the adultery not because you need money from lovers, but because it makes you feel good. And you're taking all these strangers to bed with you instead of your husband. And you're even making gifts to these lovers in order to bribe them to come. The adulteries of Jerusalem were worse than the practices of a common prostitute, and that with a prostitute is paid by the person engaged in these acts with her. Jerusalem wasn't accepting payment. She was paying others to come and partake in these adulterous practices. And Ezekiel here in these first 34 verses enumerates 8 reasons for the exile. Pride, verse 15, spiritual prostitution, verses 15 through 19, materialistic idolatry, verses 16 through 19, human sacrifice, verses 20 and 21, forgetting God, verse 22, propagating this prostitution, verses 23 through 25, trusting in these relations with these pagan nations, verses 26 through 29, and a weak will, really, that cast off any type of moral restraint in verses 30 through 34. So just in the first half of this chapter, Israel, God is reminding you, went from this despised, unwanted, rejected orphan that I watched grow and I took care of and I protected, and I laid my cloth over, making this marriage proposal, and I made covenant with you, and I lavished you with everything, and you took it all, and you prostituted it all away, throwing it all back in my face. And that leads to verses 35 through 43, which is now judgment. Therefore, you prostitute, right? No longer not you orphan or my bride, you prostitute. Hear the word of the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says. Because you poured out your lust, and because you exposed your naked body in your promiscuity with your lovers, and because of all your detestable idols, and because you gave them your children's blood through sacrifice, therefore I am going to gather all of your lovers, with whom you found pleasure, the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, those that you loved, those that you hated, and I will gather them all against you from all around, and I will strip you in front of them, and they will see you again stark naked. God is announcing this judgment that he's going to bring upon Jerusalem because of all of her rebellious unfaithfulness, idolatry, adultery, bloodshed. He would bring all of these nations that Jerusalem had slept with, in verse 25, bring them all against her, and they would abuse her, and they would destroy her. And many nations cooperated with or rejoiced with the Babylonians when they destroyed Jerusalem, including not just the Egyptians and the Assyrians, but the Edomites, the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Philistines. God had brought them all against this prostitute. Verse 38, and I will sentence you to the punishment of women who commit adultery and shed blood. I will bring on you the blood vengeance of my wrath and jealous anger, and then I will deliver you into the hands of your lovers, these pagan nations, and they will strip you down. They will tear down your mounds. They will destroy your lofty shrines. They will strip you of your clothes. They will take your fine jewelry, and they will leave you stark naked. God was going to deal with Jerusalem like people at this time dealt with murderers and adulterers. The punishment that the Mosaic law prescribed for a city that practiced idolatry, which was spiritual adultery, was the sword. It was death. Deuteronomy 13:15. The punishment for the city that practiced adultery, physical adultery, was stoning to death. That was Leviticus chapter 20. So God's going to punish Jerusalem severely because of their deeds here, breaking this covenant. And he's going to do this in his wrath and his jealousy. Verse 38, right? He would turn her over to all these lovers that were going to take from her everything that she had, and we're going to strip her down and leave her naked, which, going back to verse 7 of this chapter, was her original condition. Now, verse 39, the word naked and the word exile, they essentially translate the same word from Hebrew. Exile meant for the people of Jerusalem collectively what nakedness meant to them personally. The public exposure of the naked body was a symbolic act of legal punishment for adulterers. It reversed in verse 10 the husband's provision of clothing, which we saw in verse 10, that God covered her in her nakedness. Now, by taking it away, takes away her identity. Verse 40, and they will bring a mob against you, who will stone you, which was the law through Moses, the covenant for adultery. They will hack you to pieces with their swords, which was the punishment for idolatry. They will burn down your houses. They will inflict punishment on you in sight of many women, and I will put a stop to your prostitution, and you will no longer pay your lovers to sleep with you. Jerusalem's lovers would incite other nations to attack and wage war against the Israelites. Her enemies would burn her houses, which we saw that in Jeremiah and here in Ezekiel. Would punish her, the people of Jerusalem, in the sight of other women, meaning many more nations, and that would bring an end to her prostitution. Verse 42, and then my wrath against you will subside, and my jealous anger will turn away from you, and I will be calm and no longer angry. Verse 43, because you did not remember the days of your youth, but instead you enraged me with all these things, I will surely bring down on your head what you have done, declares the sovereign Lord. Did you not add lewdness to all your other detestable practices? So the punishment that God is going to bring down on the people was going to satisfy his anger against them. Israel had enraged God by not remembering his goodness to her, by her lewd conduct, and so now he's going to punish her for that conduct. So on top of all her other sins, she would not practice that any longer. Verses 44 through 59 outline the depravity of Jerusalem. So verse 44, everyone who quotes Proverbs, and remember we looked at this a few chapters ago, that these false prophets were making up these proverbs for the people. So everyone, you like to quote Proverbs, quote this one about you, like mother, like daughter. Verse 45, you are a true daughter of your mother, who despised her husband and her children, and you are a true sister of your sisters, who despised their husbands and their children. Your mother was a Hittite, your father was an Amorite. This goes back to the beginning of this chapter. Your older sister was Samaria, who lived to the north of you with her daughters, and your younger sister, who lived to the south of you with her daughters, was Sodom. So what does all this mean? You like to quote all these proverbs. Quote this like mother, like daughter in regard to you. She was like her Hittite mother, who was also idolatrous and selfish. She was like her older sister Samaria, who was dependent on these pagan gods. She was like her younger sister Sodom, which was sexually immoral, and all these villages despised their husbands. And so the Hebrew text here describes Samaria and Sodom as being on Jerusalem's left, which is the north, and right, which is the south, respectively. And that reflects the custom of this time, of the orientation of the city. In other words, surrounded by these idolatrous locations that you are no better than, like mother, like daughter. Verse 47, you not only followed their ways, Samaria and Sodom and the Hittites and the Amorites, you not only followed their ways and copied their detestable practices, but in all your ways you became more depraved than they were. Jerusalem acted even worse than Samaria and Sodom. The depraved worship of the people of Canaan when they entered the promised land, it had affected all of these areas. But Jerusalem was the worst of them all. Verse 48, and as surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, your sister Sodom and her daughters never did what you and your daughters have done. Verse 49, now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, and they were overfed, and they were unconcerned, and they did not help the poor and the needy, and they were haughty, and they did detestable things before me. And so I did away with them, as you have seen. But the people of Sodom were still not as bad as the people of Jerusalem. The Sodomites They were arrogant, they were selfish, they were sinners, they had material abundance, and this perceived security that they had fostered this sexual perversion. And when God saw it, he removed them. Jerusalem was even worse than Sodom. And the Hebrew word here translated detestable in verse 50, or your translation may have abominations. It's the same word that appears in Leviticus 19. It's the same word attributed to Sodom and Gomorrah. These were detestable abominations in the sight of the Lord. He did away with the Sodomites. Jerusalem was worse. Verse 51, and Samaria. So, yeah, the people of Sodom, they were bad. What about the Samaritans? Well, they did not commit half the sins you, Jerusalem, have committed. You've done more detestable things than they have. You've made your sisters seem righteous by all these things you have done. And because of your disgrace, for you have furnished some justification for your sisters, because your sins were more vile than hers, they appear to be more righteous than you. So then be ashamed, bear your disgrace, for you have made your sisters, Samaria, appear righteous. So Samaria, like Sodom, was bad, but not half as bad as Jerusalem. In fact, Jerusalem had made the Samaritans look good by comparison. The Israelites made Sodom look good by comparison. That was a disgrace to Jerusalem, that they had made these wicked cities look righteous. Verse 53, however, I will restore the fortunes of Sodom and her daughters, and I will restore the fortunes of Samaria and her daughters, and your fortunes along with them, so that you may bear your disgrace and be ashamed of all that you have done in giving them comfort. And your sisters, Sodom with her daughters, and Samaria with her daughters, will return to what they were before. You and your daughters will return to what you were before. In spite of all the wickedness of these cities, God promised to restore them all. Jerusalem's captivity was going to bring humiliation and shame to the people when they realized that this judgment was a comfort to the people of Sodom and the people of Samaria. The people of Sodom and Samaria were now dead. But this is parable, right? And it's showing this captivity of Jerusalem, this exile, this punishment, is demonstrating to Sodom and Samaria that Jerusalem was much worse than these two horrible places. Yet the Lord would end the captivity, and their descendants would have a future. And the main point here is God's willingness to restore Jerusalem, despite the magnitude of their sin, that these sins were so bad they made the Sodomites look righteous. But God is still willing to restore them. And that would have been a offer of hope, not just to the people of Jerusalem, but to all other nations that violate God's law in blatant, detestable ways. Verse 56, you would not even mention your sister Sodom on the day of your pride, before your wickedness was uncovered. Even so, you are now scorned by the daughters of Edom, and all her neighbors, and the daughters of the Philistines, and all those around you who despise you. So the people of Jerusalem didn't even speak of the Sodomites, because their sins were worse. But in the future, the Edomites, the Philistines, these ancient enemies of Israel, they would not speak of Jerusalem, because Jerusalem was such great sinners. So you see the irony here. The people of Jerusalem, well, we can't talk about the people of Sodom. They were horrible sinners. Well, now it's come around that even these ancient enemies of Israel, the Philistines and the Edomites, can't even speak of Jerusalem because of the magnitude of their sins. Verse 58. And you will bear the consequences of your lewdness and your detestable practices, declares the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says. Verse 59. I will deal with you as you deserve, because you have despised my oath by breaking the covenant. The people of Israel, they were bearing the penalty of these abominations. How? Well, the Babylonians were threatening to completely destroy them. And so God's promising to deal with them just as they had dealt with him. They had despised God's covenant, and now he would despise them. But in spite of all that, God still promises to remember and stand by his covenant with Abraham, going all the way back to Genesis 12. And that's what the last few verses here are about, the restoration of Jerusalem. So verse 60, and yet I will remember my covenant that I made with you in the days of your youth, that covenant through Abraham, and I will establish an everlasting covenant with you. And then you will remember your ways, and you will be ashamed when you receive your sisters, both those who are older than you and those who are younger. So God would establish a new everlasting covenant with his people in the future. Jesus at the Last Supper, this is my blood, the blood of the new, the everlasting covenant, shed for you and for many, for forgiveness of sins. This is going to come to pass. When we get into chapter 48, we'll see more of what this looks like when the other cities of Canaan come under the authority of Israel. But the Israelites would remember their shame and their sinful ways. Next verse, and I will give them to you as daughters, but not on the basis of my covenant with you. So these other nations would come under Israel's authority. And again, we'll get to that at the last chapter. Not because of their faithfulness to the covenant through Moses, but because of God's grace. And then finally, verse 62, and I will establish my covenant with you. You will know that I am the Lord. And then when I make atonement for you for all you have done, you will remember and be ashamed and never again open your mouth because of your humiliation, declares the sovereign Lord. So God is promising to establish his new everlasting covenant with his people, and then they would know that he is God. And he would do this to humble the people, to stimulate them to obey him by this demonstration of forgiveness. And that is Ezekiel chapter 16, and that is a lot of information. So I do pray that has been a help. Go back and reread the chapter, check your notes, watch the video again. And I pray that that has been a help as we go through these chapters of the Bible one by one. Tomorrow, we'll look at chapter 17, a little bit shorter study. We'll look at this next parable of the two eagles. So I look forward to sharing that with you, but thank you again for being here. Have a wonderful rest of your evening. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I look forward to seeing you very soon. Till then, take care, and God bless. Bye-bye.